Hey everyone, how's it hanging?
As someone who's pro-life, I think there's a better way that pro-lifers can prove that abortion is wrong. But first, we have to rethink the way that we approach the argument. Consider the typical pro-life argument, which usually consists of 3 pillars. Life begins at conception, fetuses look like babies, and the fetus has the genetic code necessary to call it a human being. From here, pro-lifers will say, Lordy, it's wrong to kill an innocent human being. But you know what? The pro-choice crowd easily responds, saying that fetuses are not persons or rational agents, and thus abortion is fine.
Well, that's an incomplete oversimplification of a common counter-argument. But you're skipping the other arguments that the pro-choice community has given in the years before and since Roe v. Wade. Now, you just listed the 3 pillars of the anti-choice position, and I'm going to tell you why all 3 of them fail. As for the first pillar, it turns out that there is no scientific basis behind this assertion. Life does not begin at conception. Life began just shy of about 4 billion years ago, and since that time has been a never-ending cycle of replication. It's easy to forget that when your head is all wrapped around a single fertilized egg. But the 2 gametes that fused together to form this zygote were both alive, as were the host organisms they derived from. So claiming that life begins at conception is just factually wrong. Life was already there. But I get it. What you really meant is that personhood begins at conception. Now honestly, have you ever really stopped to consider how plainly absurd that is? That a single cell should have equal legal standing to a viable human being? Changing the definition of personhood to include zygotes would mean that the death of a zygote by the woman carrying it would make that death a homicide, as it would always be a case of a person being killed by another person. By law, homicides must be investigated for potential criminality, which means that miscarriages would have to be investigated too, and that would violate the very principle that Roe v. Wade of 1973 was ruled upon, the right to privacy. It would also be a largely unenforceable law, as many women can miscarry without even knowing that they were pregnant. Ironically, granting personhood to zygotes would also severely restrict assisted reproductive technology. In vitro fertilization would be all but impossible to perform correctly and efficiently. It involves the use of fertility drugs, which stimulate the ovaries to release several ova during a cycle. Doctors then extract the ova, fertilize them in a lab, and then insert them into the woman's uterus. And since in vitro fertilization is used for women who have been unable to conceive naturally, many eggs need to be fertilized for a better chance of success. Of course, this can result in multiple implantations, in which the woman would most likely have to terminate some of them in order to keep from losing all of them. Now, if all these zygotes and blastocysts and embryos are people, with the same rights that are granted to all persons, then terminating them would be criminal homicide. Terminating ectopic pregnancies, which are also medical emergencies, would also be considered homicide. And what happens if blastocysts do not implant? Have they then committed suicide? Because they're people, right? The second pillar is merely an appeal to emotion. Depending on the trimester, of course human fetuses look like babies. That's what they're developing into. The question is viability, not how cute they are. The third pillar is just stating the obvious, but for the purposes of the discussion, irrelevant. Again, this isn't about the question of whether or not it's alive or human. The question is viability, as was set down by Planned Parenthood versus Casey of 1992.
The problem with the abortion debate is that it focuses over the biological category of the fetus.
No, there's no debate over that. The biological category of a fetus is fetus.
Instead of debating over the fetus, let's discuss why killing is wrong in the first place.
And I'm going to stop you right there. There's a few things that instantly pop into my head over this why killing is bad narrative you're about to step into. Being that you are a Christian, the first one would be how you can possibly reconcile this concept with all of the gratuitous, barbarous slaughter of innocents that infest the Bible, either at the command or with the condoning by the God that you worship. There's far too many to list here, so I'll just leave a link for you in the description box. Good luck. Secondly, when did humanity agree that killing is bad? And by killing, I assume that you're talking about homicide, the killing of people. We live in a country in which many states, including the federal government, allows for the death penalty, which, as I understand, is quite popular among the conservatives and Republicans. Not to mention, we also recognize justifiable homicide, such as in cases of self-defense, as well as engaging in warfare. Killing is bad, most of the time, but nothing is absolute.
It doesn't matter whether you're shot, stabbed, or strangled. Killing isn't wrong because your heart stops beating. Let me say that again. Killing is not wrong because it changes the biological state of the victim. Rather, it's wrong because of what it takes away from the victim. Killing takes away the experiences, activities, and enjoyment that would have otherwise composed your future. So if killing is wrong because it deprives someone of their future, then the implications for abortion should be obvious. If killing is wrong because it takes away your future, and every normal fetus has a future just like ours, then it makes sense that abortion is an incredible moral wrong that's equal to killing.
Except that this whole argument relies on the presupposition that a zygote, a blastocyst, an embryo, and an early-term fetus all have personhood, and they do not. And as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court ruled that personhood relies on viability, which depends on if a fetus is developed enough to be able to function independently and outside of the uterus. If a fetus is not yet developed enough, and would die anyway if removed from its host mother's uterus, then it has no viability, so it's not a person, and it has no independent rights. It's part of the woman's body, so it's her call.
Now, even if I've convinced you that abortion is wrong,
no offense, Daniel, but I don't think you've convinced anyone of anything, not even the fence sitters. Your arguments just aren't compelling or unique.
there are going to be some people who turn this into a woman's rights issue and try to distract you from the morality of it all. But what if I told you that women don't have an absolute right over their own body? Oh, snap! To find out if I'm being as offensive as I sound, or if I said what I meant and meant what I said, be sure to subscribe, like me on Facebook, and stay tuned for part 2.
Just an observation, the whole shtick of trying to be edgy and controversial for its own sake is lame and really obvious. Take it down a notch.
In my previous video, I explained why I personally believe abortion is immoral, but one of the most common comments I received was,
"But you're a man. You can't talk about abortion until you can get pregnant." Meh.
Well, that's just nonsense. Of course you have the right to an opinion. Do not forget, however, that you are passing moral judgment, which your Jesus specifically spoke out against, on medical conditions and decisions that can never be applied to you. Males cannot become pregnant, only females can. So the issues regarding pregnancy and abortion, these are female issues. And many females are quite sore of past and current incidents of certain kinds of male and, more importantly, unscientific opinions being made into laws that will never affect themselves, but serve only to restrict the autonomy of females.
Anyways, using the whole woman's rights argument to defend abortion is misleading. Pro-lifers aren't trying to touch your uterus or tell you what you can and can't do in the bedroom. Even if abortion was outlawed, women would still have their freedom and their rights. All of them. Let me be clear, abortion, or the right to your body for that matter, are not absolute rights.
Well, we already know that. Abortion is not legal after viability, except when medically necessary. But seriously, if abortion was outlawed entirely, how then would women still have all of their rights when they've clearly just lost a big one? The right to terminate their pregnancies.
Essentially, we have 3 types of rights. A natural right, which is something that's God-given or inherent with being human.
In other words, they don't exist. So-called natural rights are a concept that comes from the Enlightenment period. It was alluded to in the Declaration of Independence, which is not a body of law, but a go fuck yourself letter to the King of England. The topic is great for philosophical debate, but you asserted that they are real, and they aren't. A right is the legal ability to do or to receive something based on certain qualifications. We humans determine those qualifications. So the concept of natural rights is a contradiction in terms.
A civil right, which is something the government legislates, and liberty, which is something that the government cannot touch.
Liberty is not a right. It's a concept of how much agency people have. And if the government cannot touch liberty, then how is it that people can be detained, jailed, and imprisoned?
The right to happiness, for instance, is natural, but it is not absolute.
We don't have a right to happiness. If we did, the IRS would not be allowed to exist.
Here's the point. People believe that the right to their bodies is absolute, that they can do whatever they want, but we as a society admit that this is flawed when people want to cut, starve, or otherwise hurt themselves.
That's because generally these actions are symptoms of a mental illness or severe distress. It has nothing to do with any principle that people lack bodily autonomy.
The reality is that when you start using women's rights as an excuse for abortions, not only is it an invalid argument, but you're putting convenience over human life. And for those who try to define human life and say that something isn't a baby but a fetus, quite frankly, I think you're being a smartass.
You're the one who is trying to turn this into a matter of semantics, and yet you're calling other people smartass? Baby is a word that in common usage meant to denote an infant in its first year or two of life. A fetus is the next stage of mammalian gestational development after the embryo phase. Just because you prefer to call it a baby doesn't mean that anyone who uses the correct terminology is being a smartass. It's called being accurate. And stating that women's rights are just an excuse for convenience over human life is extremely laughable coming from someone who has such a gross ignorance of civil law and human biology. It seems that you have chosen the convenience of pushing your narrative over that which is demonstrably true.
The problem is that 86% of abortions are done out of convenience.
You didn't cite a source for this, Daniel. You're on the World Wide Web's biggest soapbox. If you're going to start spitting out numbers, then it is your responsibility to back it up with data. But even if this percentage is correct, so what? Since you want to talk morality, it goes both ways. Is it more moral to have females childbear themselves into sickness and poverty? Is it more moral to force victims of rape and incest to bear the products of their assaults? Is it more moral to block females' access to safe abortion procedures in favor of females subjecting themselves to illegal and life-threatening practices? And what of the other 14%, Daniel? Are you implying that you're okay with terminating pregnancies if they're not elective? I thought killing was wrong.
We're trying to turn a natural right, such as the right to our body or the right to happiness, into absolute rights that we can enjoy in every circumstance whatsoever. But to me, that's just the first step to becoming a hedonistic society.
Sounds good to me. Provided that one's aims for pleasure do not intrude on another's rights. What's wrong with hedonism? As far as I'm concerned, it's what makes life worth living, as long as you behave responsibly. It seems that your whole argument is that legal abortion makes people's lives too comfortable for your liking. After all, when contraception fails, folks can still relieve themselves of unwanted pregnancies, which frees society up to enjoy sex without ruining their lives. Can't have that. What is it with some Christians in this kink for total abstinence of pleasure? It goes straight to this self-righteous BS that the more you repress yourself, the holier you are. Not a good way to sell your school of thought. Children should never be seen as the price people pay for getting their rocks off, and civil law should never intrude on bodily autonomy.